Welcome to AERO 3630, Introduction to Air Traffic Control, Presentation 1B on the basics. Today's presentation will include the history of the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, the structure of the FAA, National Airspace System, operating systems of the FAA, and also some air traffic controller roles. The history of air traffic control goes back to the early days of aviation, 1903 to 1925, starting with Wilbur and Orville Wright. After the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk, aviation began to grow, and we saw things like barnstorming. The U.S. Airmail started service in 1918 with pilots from the U.S. Army. There were agricultural applications, crop dusting, that showed up around 1919, and then the first transatlantic crossing using radio aids as navigation occurred in the year 1919. Here's a picture of Archie W. League. Archie was the first ever air traffic controller, and he worked at St. Louis Lambert Municipal Airport in 1929. Notice how Archie used different colored flags to communicate with aircraft in the air. He also used a spotlight to guide aircraft down to the airport in IFR weather or at night. Because of the obvious limitations of colored flags, light guns soon replaced them as a means of communication with aircraft in the air. Light guns were equipped with a gun sight that let the controller aim the beam of light accurately at a specific aircraft. And it was also equipped with different colored lenses to allow communication, different things with aircraft. For example, a red light advised the pilots to hold their aircraft, and a green light told them to proceed. Here are some important dates to remember. The Air Commerce Act of 1926 is the act that empowered Commerce Secretary with functions and responsibilities that were vital to aviation. In 1934, the Aeronautics Branch was renamed the Bureau of Air Commerce. And then in 1938, the Civil Aeronautics Act established an independent aviation agency. It was called the Civil Aeronautics Authority. And it was subsequently renamed to the Civil Aeronautics Administration in 1940. And then after a mid-air collision over the Grand Canyon, the Federal Aviation Act of 1958 established an independent Federal Aviation Agency, and it was called the Federal Aviation Agency. And the administrator reported directly to the President of the United States. Then in 1967, Congress created the Department of Transportation, or the DOT, and the FAA was placed inside the DOT. The NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, was also created in 1967. So here's a timeline of the history of the Federal Aviation Administration, starting in 1926. Notice that the Department of Transportation Act was in 1966, which resulted in a change to the Federal Aviation Agency name to the Federal Aviation Administration. That didn't occur, and implementation of the act didn't occur until 1967. Another important date to remember is 1970, when the Air Traffic Controllers Union organized a sick-out. And 2,000 controllers did not report to work that day. So management personnel were required to work, and that delayed traffic across the U.S. and resulted in an agreement eventually reached between PATCO and the FAA, and the controllers eventually returned to work. And in 1978, the Airline Deregulation Act occurred, and before this, the fares were highly regulated by the Civil Aeronautic Board. This opened up airways to the open market, and new airlines were formed in record time. As a result, there were unforeseen rapid increases in air traffic, and this resulted in the hub and spoke system that the airlines have used to this day. Then in 1981, PATCO, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, advocated a slowdown, and this was to force an issue over pay with the FAA. Despite a warning from the FAA and from Congress and the President, PATCO staged an illegal strike on August 3rd. And 2 days later, the controllers disregarded a presidential ultimatum from President Ronald Reagan to return to work. And as a result, they were all fired. Over 10,000 air traffic controllers participated in the illegal job action. The FAA faced a shortage of controllers after that, all the way to the 2000s, the turn of the century. And by an act of Congress, the controllers cannot be older than 30 years old when they're first employed by the FAA. And depending on what kind of position they hold, most controllers are required to retire after 20 to 30 years of service. So about almost all of the active controllers that were hired between 1981 and 1990 are probably close to retirement age, which is going to cause another shortage. Here's an organizational chart. The FAA administrator reports directly to the Secretary of Transportation. Again, they are part of the Department of Transportation. And then under the FAA administrator, you see different departments: security and hazardous materials, region and center operations. One of the most important that we'll discuss today is the Air Traffic Organization. Again, the FAA administrator, who is simply called the administrator, is housed in Washington, D.C., and that position reports directly to the Secretary of Transportation. The administrator provides direction for the FAA headquarters and the Air Traffic Organization and associated regions and field offices, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Here's a simplified organizational chart for the Air Traffic Organization, or the ATO, and that includes the acquisition and business, finance, operations, strategy and performance, and also NextGen, the future plan for air traffic management, is also part of the ATO. So air traffic control falls under operations, and it's just one part of the ATO. Other offices under the ATO include finance, acquisition and business, strategy and performance, and, as I said before, NextGen and operations planning. Here is a look at the FAA regional structure. There are 9 different regions, starting in the east with the New England region, the eastern region, and the southern region. And then in the Midwest, the Great Lakes region, Central region, and the Southwest region. And on the West Coast, Northwest Mountain, Western Pacific region, and the Alaskan region. The Air Traffic Organization air traffic control facilities are assigned to one of 3 areas or regions, geographic locations, in the eastern, central, and western part of the United States. Here's a graphic showing each of the regions. The FAA lines of authority, there are clear and distinct lines of operating authority, and they're established within the FAA. They extend all the way from the administrator down to the air traffic controller. Because communications is a two-way process, it also flows in reverse from the floor controller through the supervisor chain up to the administrator. And here's a graphic that demonstrates that communication, line of communication. This is very important to remember. The foundation of the air traffic control system in the United States is the National Airspace System. The National Airspace System is predominantly owned, it's predominantly operated and maintained by the FAA. There is some overhead involvement by the Department of Transportation, but most of the responsibility falls on the FAA. Here's a graphic that shows you a couple of the components of the National Airspace System. On the left, you see an airport ramp. Airports are part of the National Airspace System. And on the right, you see satellite and ground-based VORs. Both are part of the National Airspace System. So again, VORs, or very high frequency omnidirectional range stations, very high frequency omnidirectional range with tactical air navigation or VORTACs, non-directional radio beacons or NDBs, instrument landing systems or ILS, which consist of a localizer and paired with a glide slope, global positioning satellites or GPS, airports, aeronautical charts, rules and regulations, procedures, personnel and equipment are all components of the National Airspace System. I'm sure some of you have seen this. This is a graphic of the National Airspace System and the different classes of airspace and their dimensions. So again, each class of airspace has unique dimensions, and there are also different rules for operating in each class of airspace. Class A airspace is reserved for high altitude and route flight between airports. Class B airspace surrounds the biggest airports in the U.S., so Class B stands for big or busiest, and Class C airspace surrounds moderately busy airports with an operating air traffic control tower. ATS routes that's a broad term that is used to identify different types of routes and airways that are used by pilots for navigation. And you can think of them as highways in the sky. There are 4 types of ATS routes. VOR airways are called Victor airways. There are RNAV Tango routes for low altitude navigation below 18,000 feet MSL. Jet routes, which exist above 18,000 feet MSL. RNAV Q routes are also used for high altitude navigation from 18,000 feet MSL. Referred to as also flight level 180. Here is a graphic showing some jet routes around Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. As you can see, they are based on VOR radials. Here's something very important to remember. The FAA definition of an airport is a landing area or an area of land or water which is used or intended to be used for departing and landing aircraft. So that's the definition of an airport. An area of land or water which is used or is intended to be used for departing and landing aircraft. Now this is something that you may not have thought about before, but aeronautical charts are part of the National Airspace System. And the aeronautical charts will show an outline of airways. It'll define boundaries of classes of airspace. It'll provide airport and nav aid information and also identify obstacles that may be a problem for pilots. In addition to aeronautical charts, publications, documents that contain rules and regulations are also part of the National Airspace System. All the personnel and equipment that is used by the FAA to manage traffic is part of the National Airspace System. And that includes personnel and equipment that is involved in the process of getting an airplane from point A to point B, and includes air traffic controllers, maintenance personnel, radios, radar antennas, and computer systems that are used every day in ATC operations. So again, air traffic controllers, maintenance personnel, radios, radar antennas, computer systems are all part of the National Airspace System. That concludes Part A of the presentation on the basics. Part B will include information about operating systems of the FAA and air traffic controller roles.